just in the Federalist Papers more broadly, how many times we see our founders writing about the norms of our civics. And one of the things that goes wrong in these kind of proceedings is we so regularly conflate policy and politics with civics. And I think that our jurisprudence should fit inside our civics, not inside our politics, because it's the overarching thing. Ken Burns often says, e pluribus unum is a core motto for America, and we have a whole bunch of pluribus and very little unum right now. We should have a lot more unum, a lot more unity about what we think the role of a judge is. And I think Senator Cruz did a really nice job of unpacking how often you and Judge Garland have been on the same side of issues, 93 and 96% of the time. Your comments yesterday about being on the team of 9, about there being no center aisle that needs to be crossed over at the court, about there being no caucus rooms in the Supreme Court, that's another way of saying if we're doing civics right in America, we should be seeing fewer and fewer political disputes trying to be settled at the court, and it means that we need to attend more to the norms of when things are going wrong in America, and we should all admit that things are a mess in this country. We've had in the governance of our country, there's a lot that's great in America right now, but in the idea that in our public square we agree on very much, I think we know that that's not true. And if you look at survey data of what high school students turn up if they try to take the immigration and naturalization test, and huge shares of high school juniors don't know that we have 3 branches of government, shame on us, not shame on them, that they don't understand that because we're not doing that basic civics. Well, Washington thought it was essential that when he was explaining what his job is as president and that it not be confused with a monarchy, he wanted to be called Mr. Washington, not honorifics. He rebuked people for bowing before him, because we might confuse our kids and grandkids that the presidency is a monarchy. So one of the fundamental problems about not understanding the limits on executive power is that we're not doing a very good job of talking together in common about all the ways that all 3 branches of government should be limited. But let's go back to Senator Coons' point about personnel. I sit on the Armed Services Committee as well, and one of the things that we do there, I don't know, every second week maybe, is that we have confirmation votes of dozens, scores, sometimes hundreds of promotions and flag officers. And why do we do that? It's because there are all sorts of constraints on executive power at the level of personnel. And when somebody is getting promoted in the Navy, or when somebody is getting promoted at the Air Force, the Congress actually has oversight of that. And because that process works so well, because there is so much collegiality between the legislature and the executive branch, it tends to not turn up on TV. It's often a pretty pro forma moment at the start of our hearings, even though any senator, Republican or Democrat, that wants to delay the promotion of those officers, we can do that because almost all that stuff is moving by consent. So there are things where there's unity in hiring or in promotion. It's just a lot of that is non-controversial, so it doesn't end up salacious. It doesn't end up on TV. Jump in, please. I know you're trying to say something.
I think that's an important addition, is that the president, and this goes to Senator Coons as well, does not have the unilateral power to, under the Constitution, to appoint even members of the cabinet, which, if you were thinking of a monarchy, of course you'd be able to dispense offices and dispense. You can't create offices, first of all, and can't unilaterally fill even Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State because the framers were so concerned about overbroad executive power that they required Senate confirmation for even those positions who, if confirmed, then become executive officers. That's another really hugely important check on the executive branch, which is a reality. And of course, the confirmation process for executive officers, as you say, becomes a part and parcel of the oversight in many ways. And I think that's very important. And I think I spent a little too little time. I mentioned it on appropriations, but that's the lifeblood of the government, of course, is the money that causes the government to, allows the government to be able to operate in terms of without money you can't do things, and a president does not have the unilateral power to appropriate money, and so Congress ultimately, through that appropriations power, and you all know this better than anyone, can restrict activities of the executive branch in multiple ways, and I think that's an important thing that Hamilton also talked about. So Congress has substantial power. Now, that's not to say the president has large powers, of course, under the Constitution, but we sometimes forget, and I think your civics lessons are a reminder that all these checks and balances work together, including on judges, in a way that has served the test of time, but could always be improved in some respects, I suppose.
And one of the reasons that the executive branch seems so powerful right now is, again, because of how weak the legislature is. I mean, it's a fundamental part of why we have the term president. In the 1780s, this wasn't a very common term in the English language. President was just a nounified form of the name presiding officer, and we made it up. Our founders made it up so that we wouldn't have a term that sounded a lot like a king. And so we wanted to be sure that the term presiding officer sounded pretty boring and administrative, because the legislative, the policymaking powers were supposed to sit in this body, and the Article II branch is supposed to preside over and execute the laws that have been passed. It's not supposed to be the locus of all policymaking in America, but one of the reasons we have some of these problems with so many of these executive agencies is because Congress regularly doesn't finish its work, punch those powers to Article II, and then it's not clear who exactly can execute all those authorities. And so we end up with this debate about the unitary executive, and you had a different term for it. But unpack for us a little bit why you have a different view about both the prudence and the constitutionality of one-person-headed independent executive agencies or pseudo-independent agencies versus commission structure-headed independent agencies.
The traditional independent agencies that were upheld by the Supreme Court and Humphrey's executor in 1935 are multi-member independent agencies. And so usually, sometimes 3, 5, occasionally more, but they're multi-member independent agencies. And that's been all the way through. And then for the significant independent agencies, the CFPB, and it's not my role to question the policy or to question the creation of the new agency. In fact, I think it was designed for efficiency and centralization of certain overlapping authorities. It's not my role to question that policy. Someone challenged the fact that it was headed for the first time on something like this by a single person. And a couple things then I wrote about in my dissent in that case. I'll just repeat what I wrote in the dissent. I said, first of all, that's a departure from historical practice of independent agencies, and that matters according to the Supreme Court. They had a previous case involving the PCAOB where they had different innovation there. The Supreme Court had struck down in part because of the novelty of it. So departure from historical practice matters because precedent always matters, including executive precedent. Then a diminution of presidential authority beyond the traditional independent agencies in this sense. With the traditional independent agencies, when a new president comes in office, almost immediately the president has been given the authority to designate a new chair of the independent agencies. So when President Obama came in, was able to designate new chairs of the various independent agencies, and the chairs, of course, set the policy direction and control the agenda. That's historically been the way. That does not happen with the CFPB. And finally, having a single person, just going back to liberty, who's in charge, who's not removable at will by anyone, not accountable to Congress, in charge of a huge agency, is something that's different and has an effect on individual liberty. So a single person can make these enormous decisions, rulemakings, adjudications, and enforcement decisions, all of them. And from my perspective, I'm just repeating what I wrote here. I'm not intending to go beyond what I wrote in that opinion. That was an issue of concern. And I did put in a hypothetical because it seems abstract that I think we'll realize this issue with that agency or any other when a president comes into office and has to live for 3, 4 years with a CFPB director appointed by the prior president. And then I think everyone's going to realize, of a different party in particular. And then I think everyone's going to realize, wow, that's an odd structure. Now, maybe not, but that's what I wrote in my opinion, that will seem very weird because that's not what happens with all the traditional independent agencies. And so whenever any president leaves and is appointed in the last 2 years, the CFPB director, the new president might campaign on consumer protection. Let's imagine, okay, presidential campaign candidate campaigns on consumer protection and consumer issues, and then comes into office and can't actually appoint a new CFPB director for the whole term of his or her office. That's going to seem, I think, quite odd structurally At least that's what I said in my opinion. Again, not intending to go beyond what I said in my opinion.
So is it fair to say that if you have a single person headed agency and the president doesn't have the authority to hire or fire this person, that that person having policy-making functions, executive functions, and judicial functions functionally becomes a fourth branch of government? Because who are they accountable to? Is that a fair summary of the concern?
Absolutely, that's a fair summary. It branch unto itself.